At 11:42 a.m., inside the Roosevelt Room of the White House, a phone call ended that should never have been placed. The advisor had been loyal for 19 months. The president had praised him 14 times on record. But loyalty, I've learned, is only as durable as the last headline. Within 90 minutes, the resignation letter was on every screen. Within 3 hours, the word betrayal was trending in 47 countries. Here's what they won't tell you: the collapse didn't start with the phone call. It started 6 weeks earlier, with a memo no one was supposed to read. Trust isn't lost in betrayal, it's exposed by it. Stay to the end, because what unfolded here wasn't just political theater. It was a case study in the economics of loyalty, and the price of silence. I've spent decades watching systems break. Markets, boardrooms, governments, they all fracture the same way. Not from external shocks, but from internal contradictions. This isn't about politics. It's about structure. It's about what happens when the incentives inside an organization stop aligning with the promises outside it. So let me ask you something: how does a trusted advisor become expendable in less than 48 hours? And more importantly, who benefits when loyalty becomes a liability? The answers aren't hidden. They're just uncomfortable. Let's trace how we got here. Not through outrage or opinion, but through the documents, the timelines, and the incentives that shaped every move. Because in the end, systems don't lie. People do. Let's introduce the players, not by their titles, but by their exposure. First, the advisor. A career strategist. Connected, experienced, and crucially, trusted by both the president and the press. His job wasn't policy. It was perception. He managed risk by managing narrative. But here's the vulnerability: his credibility depended on two audiences with opposing interests. The White House needed silence. The media needed stories. He was the bridge, and bridges break under weight. Second, the president. A man whose political capital is tied to control. Every leak is a loss. Every headline without his approval is a challenge to authority. Loyalty, for him, isn't emotional. It's transactional. It's insurance. Third, the White House legal team. Their job isn't truth, it's containment. They operate in the space between what happened and what can be proven. And they knew something the advisor didn't: delay isn't defense. It's liability transfer. Here's what you need to understand: in high-pressure environments, loyalty is a currency. And like any currency, it fluctuates based on risk. Delay is currency, and they were buying time. Let me explain something I learned early in my career, something that applies to every boardroom, every government, every institution that relies on confidence to function. Trust is not an emotion. It's an asset. And like any asset, it has liquidity, depreciation, and a breaking point. When you run a company, you can survive a bad quarter. You can survive a lawsuit. You can even survive a scandal, if trust remains intact. But the moment your shareholders, your employees, or your customers believe you're managing perception instead of reality, the asset collapses. Governments work the same way. The public doesn't need to love their leaders. But they need to believe the system is predictable. That rules apply. That consequences follow actions. The advisor understood this. He'd built a career on managing trust as a tradable commodity. He knew when to speak, when to withhold, and when to leak just enough to satisfy curiosity without triggering investigation. But here's the flaw in that model: trust only works when both parties believe the relationship is stable. The moment one side starts calculating exit costs, the other side is already insolvent. By mid-September, the advisor had become a risk concentration. He knew too much. He'd been present in too many meetings. He'd signed off on too many statements that were now under review. In financial terms, he was an over-leveraged asset in a declining market. And when assets become liabilities, institutions don't hesitate. They liquidate. Markets collapse when confidence does. Governments aren't any different. Now let's talk about the memo. September 23, internal White House communication. Distributed to 7 recipients, including the Chief of Staff, the Press Secretary, and the Legal Counsel. The subject line read, Alignment Protocol, immediate review required. That's not bureaucratic language. That's code. Here's the relevant excerpt, verbatim, given the current media cycle and ongoing inquiries, we recommend a comprehensive audit of all external communications originating from senior advisory roles. Any discrepancies between authorized messaging and public statements should be flagged for immediate review and corrective action. Let me translate that. They weren't concerned about accuracy. They were concerned about control. The phrase, corrective action, doesn't mean clarification. It means consequence. Now, here's what most people miss: the memo wasn't about the advisor. It was about everyone. It was a preemptive move to establish a paper trail. So that if something broke, and they clearly believed something would, they could point to a document and say, we warned them. We had a process. That's liability management. That's not governance. The advisor received his copy on September 24. He didn't respond in writing. That was his first mistake. Because silence, in a documented system, isn't neutrality. It's consent. So what does that mean? It means the decision to remove him wasn't made in October. It was made the moment he didn't object in writing. They'd already built the case. They were just waiting for the trigger. And the trigger came 5 weeks later, in the form of a single interview. Let's pause here. Because there's another document most people never saw. October 29. A private transcript from a recorded phone conversation between the advisor and a journalist. Not public. Not leaked, at least not at first. But someone had access to it. And someone knew it contradicted 3 prior official statements. Here's the line that mattered, look, off the record, we knew the timeline didn't add up. But the priority was to control the narrative until we had legal clarity. That sentence is 18 words. But it contains 3 admissions: awareness, delay, and intent. The room, when this was presented to senior staff, didn't erupt. It froze. Because everyone in that room understood what it meant. It meant the advisor had prioritized perception over process. It meant he'd admitted, on record, that official statements were strategic, not factual. And here's the thing about admissions: they don't require proof. They are the proof. Silence is just guilt in slow motion. Within 24 hours, 3 things happened. First, the White House legal team requested a voluntary resignation. Not a termination. A resignation. That's important. Because terminations trigger investigations. Resignations close files. Second, the press secretary issued a statement praising the advisor's service and wishing him well. Neutral. Polite. Completely free of specifics. Third, the advisor's name was quietly removed from the internal contact directory. No announcement. No memo. Just absence. That's not betrayal. That's protocol. It's the corporate equivalent of a margin call. When your position becomes untenable, the system doesn't negotiate. It liquidates. But here's where it gets interesting. The advisor didn't go quietly. Within 6 hours of his removal, a second leak appeared. This time, it included email chains, meeting notes, text messages. All carefully redacted to protect sources, but detailed enough to raise questions about who knew what, and when. That's not revenge. That's leverage. He was sending a signal: if I fall, I'm not falling alone. And that's when the word betrayal entered the conversation. Because the White House couldn't admit they'd removed him for liability reasons. That would validate the concerns. So they framed it as a breakdown in trust. A personal failure. A regrettable but necessary separation. The advisor, in turn, framed it as retaliation for refusing to lie. Two stories. Both true in part. Neither complete. And the truth, as always, was buried somewhere in the middle. Now, let me show you the part that doesn't make headlines but explains everything. The problem here wasn't the advisor. It wasn't the president. It wasn't even the leaked transcript. The problem was the bottleneck. In any high-stakes organization, there's always a point where information passes through a single control node. In this case, that node was the advisor. He filtered what went up to the president. He shaped what went out to the press. He managed the gap between internal reality and external narrative. That's immense power. And immense risk. Because the moment that bottleneck becomes unreliable, whether through error, disloyalty, or simply bad luck, the entire information architecture collapses. Think of it like a supply chain. If one factory controls 90% of a critical component, and that factory goes offline, it doesn't matter how strong the rest of the system is. Everything stops. The advisor had become a single point of failure. And the White House, once they realized that, had two options: reinforce the bottleneck or eliminate it. They chose elimination. Not because it was ethical. Because it was faster. The problem isn't the delay itself. It's who controls the clock, and once they realized they'd lost control of the clock, the advisor's position was already gone. The phone call was just paperwork. So let's play this forward. Because what happens next depends entirely on one factor: accountability. Scenario 1, the documents stay internal. If the leaked materials are dismissed as unverified, or if no formal inquiry is launched, then this becomes a footnote. The advisor moves to the private sector. The White House refines its communication protocols. The cycle continues. In this scenario, the system survives. Not because it's healthy, but because it's opaque. Scenario 2, the documents trigger an investigation. If Congress or an independent body decides to review the timeline, the communications, and the decision-making process, then the exposure expands. It's no longer about one advisor. It's about the infrastructure that allowed the situation to develop in the first place. In this scenario, the system doesn't collapse. But it fractures. Trust erodes. Credibility becomes a contested asset. And every future statement is viewed through the lens of this case. Here's the trigger to watch: congressional subpoena requests. If those are filed within the next 2 weeks, Scenario 2 is in motion. If not, Scenario 1 holds. But here's what I know from experience: silence delays consequences. It doesn't erase them. If the court acts by Monday, trust survives. If not, precedent expires in silence. Now, let me address the most common defense I've heard. They'll say this was about national security. That the advisor had access to sensitive information, and his removal was a precautionary measure to protect classified operations. That's plausible. And it might even be partially true. But here's the problem with that argument: if national security was the concern, the removal would have been immediate and silent. No resignation letter. No press statement. No public narrative. Instead, we got a managed rollout. A carefully timed sequence of leaks, statements, and responses designed to shape perception. That's not security protocol. That's reputation management. And the moment you prioritize reputation over process, you're no longer protecting the institution. You're protecting individuals within it. Secrecy stops being protection when it starts protecting the powerful. Let me tell you about something I learned in 1991. We were evaluating an acquisition. The company looked good on paper. Revenue was strong. Leadership was experienced. But there was one issue: the decision-making process was entirely centralized around the CEO. Every major contract required his signature. Every communication went through his office. Every strategic pivot depended on his approval. We passed on the deal. Not because the CEO was incompetent, but because the company couldn't survive his absence. Systems that depend on individuals are fragile. Systems that depend on process are resilient. The White House, like any large organization, is supposed to operate on process. There are legal reviews, compliance checks, documented protocols for communication, classification, and accountability. But process only works when it's followed. And it's only followed when there's a cost to bypassing it. The advisor's removal exposed a fundamental flaw: the process was optional. It existed on paper, but in practice, decisions were made based on proximity, loyalty, and convenience. That's not governance. That's favoritism dressed as structure. And here's the thing about systems built on favoritism: they work beautifully, until they don't. Because the moment trust breaks down, there's no scaffolding to hold the organization together. No clear rules. No predictable consequences. Just chaos disguised as decisiveness. Documents don't blink, I'll say that again, because it matters. Documents don't blink, they don't forget. They don't revise themselves under pressure. They don't change their story when the audience changes. And that's why process matters. Because in the absence of documentation, truth becomes negotiable. And when truth becomes negotiable, power becomes the only currency that matters. So here's the lesson. The real lesson. Loyalty is not a virtue when it's selective. Trust is not an asset when it's conditional. And systems are not stable when they depend on personalities instead of principles. The advisor was removed not because he betrayed the president, but because he became a risk the system couldn't afford. The president didn't betray the advisor, he followed the logic of self-preservation. Neither side is innocent. And neither side is entirely wrong. But here's what we can say with certainty: this situation was preventable. Not through better people, but through better systems. If the communication protocols had been enforced. If the documentation requirements had been followed. If accountability had been baked into the structure instead of applied selectively, none of this would have happened. But that would have required something most organizations resist: transparency. Because transparency is expensive. It's slow. It limits flexibility. And it exposes mistakes before they become crises. But the alternative, the system we just watched collapse, is far more expensive. When rules bend for convenience, they stop being rules. They become tools, and tools cut both ways. If this kind of analysis matters to you, if you value clarity over noise, structure over spectacle, then subscribe. Because this isn't the last time we'll see this pattern. It's playing out in boardrooms, courtrooms, and government offices across the world. And every time it does, the same questions arise: who knew? When did they know? And why didn't the system stop it? Next episode, we're looking at the 3 signals that decide whether systems hold or fracture under pressure. It's not about politics. It's about design. And design, unlike loyalty, is measurable. If clarity matters to you as much as truth, subscribe. Within 4 hours of the advisor's resignation, 3 hashtags were trending globally: hashtag White House betrayal, hashtag leaked memos, and hashtag trust collapse. By the following morning, 6 sitting senators had called for a formal review. By the end of the week, the advisor had retained legal counsel. The story didn't end with the phone call. It metastasized. Because here's what institutions forget: removal doesn't erase knowledge. It just relocates it. The advisor is no longer inside the building. But the documents are. The emails are. The recordings are. And now, for the first time in 19 months, he has every incentive to use them. The truth was never hidden, only delayed. I've said this before, and I'll say it again: you don't protect democracy by delaying it. You don't preserve trust by hiding mistakes. And you don't build resilient systems by prioritizing loyalty over accountability. The advisor made mistakes. The White House made mistakes. But the real failure wasn't personal. It was structural. Because the system allowed this to happen. It rewarded short-term control over long-term stability. It prioritized narrative over process. And when the pressure mounted, it chose expediency over principle. That's not unique to this White House. It's not unique to this administration. It's a flaw embedded in every organization that values power more than process. And until we fix that, until we build systems that constrain individuals instead of empowering them, we'll keep watching the same collapse, again and again, in different rooms, with different names. But the pattern will stay the same. Mantra * trust is the real currency. Now let me show you something most analysts overlook. The incentive map. Every decision, every statement, every calculated move in this situation was driven by invisible forces. Not good or evil. Not loyalty or betrayal. But incentives. The advisor's incentive was survival. Not moral survival, financial and reputational survival. His value was tied to access. The moment he lost that access, his market value collapsed. So his play was predictable: release enough information to remain relevant, but not so much that he becomes legally vulnerable. That's not revenge. That's portfolio protection. The president's incentive was control. Every leak represented a loss of control. Every unauthorized statement was a crack in the narrative foundation. Removing the advisor wasn't personal, it was operational. A controlled demolition to prevent uncontrolled collapse. The legal team's incentive was containment. Their job isn't to determine what happened. It's to limit what can be proven. They operate in the gray space between truth and liability, and their strategy is always the same: minimize exposure, maximize deniability, and create enough procedural complexity that accountability diffuses into bureaucracy. And here's the critical insight: none of these incentives align with the public interest. Not because these are bad people, but because the system rewards short-term self-preservation over long-term institutional health. Think about that. The most rational decision for every individual actor in this situation was to prioritize personal protection over systemic transparency. That's not a bug. That's the design. And until we redesign the incentives, we'll keep getting the same outcomes. Let's talk about leaks. Because there's a misconception that leaks are impulsive, emotional acts of desperation or conscience. They're not. Leaks are strategic instruments. And in this case, they were deployed with precision. The first leak, the one that appeared in mid-October, was a warning shot. It didn't reveal anything actionable. But it signaled to the White House, I have access, and I'm willing to use it. The second leak, the one that followed the advisor's removal, was different. It included specifics. Dates. Names. Contradictions. That wasn't a warning. That was a negotiation. Here's what the advisor was saying, without saying it, I can make this worse. But I'd prefer not to. So let's talk about terms. And here's what the White House was calculating: how much damage can he actually do? How much of what he has is verifiable? And how much of our response will validate his claims? That's the game theory of institutional conflict. It's not about truth. It's about leverage. The advisor has information. The White House has resources. And both sides are trying to determine the price at which the other side settles. But here's the risk: the longer this plays out, the more third parties get involved. Congressional committees. Media investigations. Independent audits. And once that happens, neither side controls the narrative anymore. The system absorbs the conflict and produces its own outcome, which, historically, is the worst outcome for everyone involved. If you're trying to understand what happens next, forget the headlines. Watch 3 documents. Document 1, the resignation letter. If it's one paragraph and generic, the advisor is protecting himself legally. If it's detailed and specific, he's building a public case. The length and tone will tell you which strategy he's chosen. Document 2, the White House's internal review. They'll commission one. They always do. If it's completed and released within 30 days, they're trying to control the narrative. If it's delayed or classified, they're trying to bury it. Document 3, congressional subpoena requests. If none are filed within 2 weeks, the situation stays contained. If multiple committees file requests simultaneously, the exposure expands beyond any individual's control. These 3 documents will determine whether this becomes a footnote or a fracture. And here's what I've learned over 6 decades in systems analysis: the documents that matter are never the ones that make headlines. They're the ones that define the boundaries of accountability. Asterisk headlines fade. Documents endure. Asterisk let me step back for a moment. Because this isn't just about one advisor or one administration. This is about the nature of power in modern institutions. Power, in the 21st century, is not about position. It's about information asymmetry. Whoever knows more, and controls what others know, holds the power. The advisor had power because he controlled information flow. He decided what the president heard, what the press received, and what the public believed. But that power was contingent. It depended on trust. And the moment that trust eroded, not because of betrayal, but because of risk calculation, the power evaporated. Here's the paradox: the more power you accumulate through information control, the more vulnerable you become to information exposure. Because the system that gave you power can revoke it instantly if you become a liability. That's not a warning. That's a structural reality. And it applies to every advisor, every executive, every board member who believes their position is secure because they're trusted. Trust is not security. Trust is a loan. And loans get called when the lender gets nervous. Asterisk power is borrowed. Accountability is permanent. Now let's talk about loyalty. Because that word has been used a lot in the coverage of this situation, and it's being used incorrectly. Loyalty, in institutional settings, is not an emotional bond. It's an exchange. I give you reliability. You give me security. But that exchange only works when both sides believe it's mutual. The advisor believed his loyalty, his discretion, his strategic communication, his willingness to manage uncomfortable narratives, would be reciprocated with protection. The White House believed the advisor's loyalty was a given, not a negotiation. And the moment his utility declined, so did their obligation. That's not betrayal. That's a mismatched expectation. And here's the lesson: loyalty without documentation is just hope. If the terms of the relationship aren't explicit, then they're negotiable. And in high-pressure environments, everything negotiable eventually gets renegotiated. The advisor should have known this. He'd seen it happen to others. He'd probably advised on similar removals himself. But proximity creates illusion. When you're inside the system, you believe you're essential. You believe your knowledge makes you irreplaceable. But here's the truth: no one is irreplaceable. Everyone is replaceable. The only question is timing and cost. Loyalty is a transaction. And every transaction has a price. Here's something that should disturb you. In the 48 hours following the advisor's removal, not a single senior White House official publicly defended him. Not one. No statements of support. No expressions of gratitude for his service. No acknowledgement of his contributions. Just silence. That silence is not accidental. It's coordinated. Because in institutional conflict, silence is a signal. It tells everyone watching, this person is no longer protected. Associating with them is now a risk. It's the organizational equivalent of a margin call. The system is liquidating a position, and everyone else is protecting their own exposure. That's not cruelty. It's self-preservation. But it reveals something critical about how modern institutions operate. They value stability over loyalty. They value control over relationships. And when those two priorities conflict, relationships lose. Every time. The advisor understood this intellectually. But emotionally, I suspect he believed he was different. That his years of service, his proximity to power, his discretion under pressure, would insulate him. They didn't. Institutions remember contributions until they don't. Let me walk you through the mechanical process of how trust collapses in high-stakes environments. Stage 1, accumulation. Small inconsistencies build up. Minor contradictions. Delayed responses. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to create a portfolio of doubt. Stage 2, concentration. The inconsistencies cluster around a single person or decision point. The system starts viewing that node as a risk concentration. Stage 3, evaluation. Leadership conducts a cost-benefit analysis. What's the cost of keeping this person? What's the cost of removing them? Which risk is more manageable? Stage 4, execution. Once the decision is made, it's implemented quickly. Not out of malice, but to minimize disruption. The goal is a clean break. Stage 5, narrative control. After the removal, both sides release competing narratives. The institution frames it as necessary. The individual frames it as unjust. And the public tries to determine which version is closer to truth. This isn't unique to this situation. It's the standard life cycle of institutional separation under pressure. And if you've watched carefully, you've seen every stage play out in real time. Asterisk collapse is not an event. It's a sequence. Asterisk here's the question that should be front and center, but isn't: who benefits from this? Not morally. Not politically. Financially. When a senior advisor with 19 months of institutional knowledge is removed, someone benefits. Maybe it's the person who replaces him. Maybe it's the people whose previous recommendations were overridden by him. Maybe it's external actors who now have leverage over someone no longer protected by the system. I don't have the answer. But I know the question matters. Because institutional conflict is never just about the stated reasons. There are always secondary and tertiary incentives at play. Follow the org chart. Look at who gets promoted in the next 60 days. Watch which policy priorities suddenly accelerate or stall. That will tell you more than any press release. Because institutions don't just remove people to solve problems. They remove people to create opportunities. And the opportunity created here is invisible, for now, so let me bring this home. Because after 26 minutes, you deserve clarity. The real currency in any institution, whether it's a government, a corporation, or a community organization, is not money. It's not loyalty. It's not even power. It's trust. Trust is what allows systems to function without constant verification. Trust is what makes delegation possible. Trust is what prevents every decision from requiring a legal review and every statement from needing a fact check. But trust is also fragile. It's built slowly, over years of consistency. And it's destroyed instantly, with a single contradiction. The advisor lost trust. Maybe he made a mistake. Maybe he was set up. Maybe the system was designed to ensure someone would eventually fail. But once trust was gone, everything else was irrelevant. The White House lost trust too. With the public, with the media, and with every future advisor who now knows that proximity is not protection. And that loss is expensive. Not immediately. But over time. Because the next advisor will be more cautious. More self-protective. More concerned with documentation than execution. And that caution, compounded across an entire organization, slows everything down. Asterisk that's the real cost of this situation. Not the headlines. The hesitation, asterisk you don't protect an institution by removing the people who expose its flaws. You protect it by fixing the flaws. You don't build loyalty by demanding it. You build it by honoring it. And you don't preserve trust by controlling information. You preserve it by being worthy of it. This situation could have been different. Not with different people. With different systems. But that would require something most institutions resist, accountability that flows upward, not just downward. Until then, we'll keep watching the same pattern repeat.